Okay, in this third and final video, in our introduction to dialogue, we're going to look at suspension of judgment, interoception, and tacit knowledge. What does it mean to suspend judgment? Well, as Boehm and Isaacs teach, dialogue, we use the technique of dialogue on topics that are important, complex, and often emotionally charged. And so we have to expect that in this kind of interaction, in this kind of way of group thinking, that strong emotions could come to the surface, both positive and negative. And when we hurry to defend our perspective, when we try to justify and defend ourselves, this is when dialogues become debates. And this is probably the biggest risk in facilitating a dialogue, is that people naturally, or at least because of their conditioning in school, are trained to debate, not to enter into a dialogue. And in a debate, as we've seen, only one perspective can win, and the others have to lose. Suspending judgment is a practice that makes dialogue possible. And suspending means holding up or holding out our emotional reactions, not suppressing or denying them, but also not acting immediately on them. And so by suspending these judgments, by looking at them, we can create the opportunity to learn something new about our relationships and ourselves. How do we do this? Boehm, he says first you should begin to notice when a strong emotion arrives. Notice what it's doing to your body. Notice the physical manifestation of this emotion. It could be that when someone says something about your work, that your cheeks get flushed, or your chin trembles, or you begin speaking fast. And what Boehm advises is when you start noticing these physical changes or effects, you have to say, look, this is not me. I'm not fully identified with this change happening in my body. It's just how I'm reacting in this situation, right? And you create a little distance between the reaction that you're having and the you, the voice in your head that allows you to choose how to use that reaction or how to either act or not act on that reaction. And so the idea is to not suppress it, not to deny it, but also not to act on it and jump in and shout in someone's face. To keep this energy suspended inside yourself so that you have time to reflect, first individually, and then share that reflection with the group. Okay, why did I react this way? Why am I reacting this way now? What could have triggered that reaction? And what does that trigger say about my own basic assumptions, what I think is just the basic fact of the world that maybe I need to loosen my grip on, need to be less certain about those basic assumptions. Isaacs puts it this way: the goal is to be able to say to yourself, though my positions may be right and my emotions are real, you don't deny that you're having these emotions, they are still not who I am. I can make space for other positions without risking my own inner stability. Suspending my views opens the space not merely for more advocacy, but also for inquiry. What do we mean by that? In this, Isaac's ideas join with very seminal work of a linguist and psychologist named Deborah Tannen. And she distinguishes a position of advocacy in a conversation. She's worked with on the kind of the details of how couples and families interact with one another, and identifies different styles in conversation that can either help or hurt the creation of peace and harmony between people. And she makes this distinction between a stance of advocacy. I'm here to defend my point of view. And if you send those signals, either explicitly or implicitly, this is when people say, okay, we're in a debate now. I have to defend myself. You have to defend yourself. That's the posture of advocacy. And instead, if we adopt a posture of inquiry, is when you send the signal in how you speak and how you hold yourself physically, that you're here to learn something, that you don't know everything, that you're curious about other people's point of view. This is the kind of posture that makes dialogue possible. So how do we adopt this posture? Again, you have to tell yourself, we're here to not to be certain, but to understand and to learn. Move from certainty to curiosity. Assume before the dialogue begins that there is some important information that will come up in this group that you didn't have access to before, right? That you haven't seen the full picture. And Tannen says, use the and stance. That yes, that what I see is true and what you see is true or has value. What I perceive and what you perceive both have value. That there isn't one truth, a single truth, but that there are things that have that each of us perceive in a way that is valid and that deserves some respect. And most often, the useful question isn't who's right. And of course, there are some things that can be factually said to be true or false. But most of what creates conflict, emotional conflict, are not factual questions, but questions of perspective, of value. And so this is where we need to create these habits of dialogue and of asking different kinds of questions instead of the question of who's right, who's wrong. Rather, okay, now that we've understood something that we didn't understand before, now that we've brought new knowledge to the table, what can we do about it that's different than what we did before? Isaacs gives this example in a company that he worked in where there was a dialogue between workers and managers, and a leader of the union, the syndicat, said, we need to suspend this word union. When you hear it, you, the managers, hear the word union, syndicat, you say, ugh. When we hear it, we say, ah. Why is that? And Isaac thought this was a real breakthrough in the dialogue, because this man, who was really attached to his beliefs of the importance of unions, had broken with a tradition of constantly defending or advocating for the union and opposing management, to probe or to explore more deeply into the basic assumptions people had. The innocence and clarity of his question opened up a rich vein of conversation. So just asking a question in this new way can lead to a totally new kind of interaction between people who are in apparent conflict. And so here's where we get to the idea of interoception. Actually, Bohm uses the word proprioception, but we now make the distinction between proprioception, which is most commonly used today as an awareness of our body in space, like great athletes have this kind of incredible awareness of where their bodies are, compared to the ball and the other players. On the one hand, interoception, which is the awareness of our own internal mental and physical states. So when Bohm says proprioception, we might understand it to mean the perception of ourselves and especially our internal mental and physical states, which is today more often called interoception. Bohm puts it this way: we come back to the realization that the thing which has gone wrong with thought is that it does things and then says or implies that it didn't do them, that they took place independently and that they constitute problems, that the problems are something outside of us and that they're basic facts about the world. Whereas what you really have to do is stop thinking that way so that you stop creating the problem, that the problems that we look at as independent facts are actually creations of our own patterns of thought. And the point of suspension is to help make interoception possible, to create a kind of a mirror that allow us to see ourselves in a new way. We can see the results of our thought, and that things we thought were basic objective facts might be linked to instead to our own assumptions and our own partial vision of the world. So let's give a little story about this. This is a totally invented story, but it might help make the idea a little clearer. Okay, Walid. Walid had been operations manager at Muhammadiyah Incorporated for 12 years. His department ran like clockwork, or so he thought, until the day HR forwarded him a cluster of complaints about toxic leadership in his team. These accusations felt like a punch in the gut, punch in the stomach. A friend of Walid suggested he convene a dialogue with his team, led by a neutral facilitator. Not the kind of thing he usually does, but reluctantly he agreed. As people on the team began sharing their stories of stress, Walid noticed his jaw was clenched and his shoulders were tight. The physical sensations made him pause. As he observed these bodily responses, he became aware of something else, a familiar pattern of thoughts cycling through his mind. These people just don't understand what it takes to maintain standards. If they can't handle feedback, maybe they're not cut out for this. I'm protecting the company's interests. They're the ones being too sensitive. And he could take a look at these were the thoughts that were coming with this physical reaction. Walid began to observe his own thinking process as if watching a movie, how quickly he jumped to defend his management style, how automatically he labeled the complaints as signs of weakness rather than data points worth examining, how his certainty about maintaining standards, quote unquote, might itself be a kind of rigidity. So he keeps listening, and the physical knot in his shoulders begins to loosen as he allows himself to question these assumptions. What if these complaints he's hearing aren't in fact threats to his authority, but information about blind spots in his leadership, les angles morts? What if maintaining standards and supporting people weren't actually in conflict? So as Walid listens, he begins to see how some of his resistance may have been from fear of being wrong, of losing control, of having to change long-held beliefs about what made him successful. As the dialogue continued, the tone of the interactions evolves beyond complaints and solutions and touches on fundamental questions about purpose, collaboration, and growth. There are even some jokes and laughter. The HR problem hadn't disappeared entirely. It's not that one dialogue will solve all the problems, but it had transformed into something else for Walid, an opportunity to observe his own thinking and action, to sense when he had felt captive by assumptions rather than thinking freshly about the situation. As he would later reflect, it wasn't about choosing between a tough or soft style of management. It was about developing his own capacity to sense when he was operating from unexamined assumptions and create new space for different kinds of interactions to emerge within his team. So this is kind of a best case scenario about this practice of interoception, being able to watch your own reactions and use that to create new kinds of thinking. So how can we develop these habits of interoception? Well, Lisa Feldman Barrett, neuroscientist, in her best-selling book, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life in the Brain, she gives a couple of practical suggestions. The first is monitor your body budget. That means the things that are happening physically in your body that can affect your emotional responses. So maybe the different foods that you eat, different kinds of sugar or how often you eat in the day can affect your energy level and thus your response in certain situations. How sleep and sleep patterns can affect your resilience, your feelings of stress in a given moment, and the importance of taking pauses and even short walks and how this can help replenish energy, and we react differently under those circumstances sometimes. A second strategy is a cognitive one, how we can build and enlarge our vocabulary of concepts. So instead of just using the word stressed, we might start thinking in more distinct ways about, okay, what's the difference between when I'm stressed because when I'm overwhelmed, stress that comes from being overwhelmed with too many things to do, and a second category, well, I'm also stressed sometimes because I'm afraid of this person's response or something that I don't know, an uncertain result. Or stressed when I'm just drained, when physically tired, and that creates stress in itself. And being able to distinguish by the way that we talk about stress, either being overwhelmed, anxious, or drained, suggests new possible solutions to that problem of stress based on our ability to talk about it. Or angry, we can distinguish between the anger that comes from being annoyed, at something temporary that doesn't go our way, being exasperated with maybe a colleague who does the same thing again and again and again, or the anger that comes from being indignant, where we feel really disrespected, and how that if we can distinguish a feeling of, let's say, indignation from one of annoyance, that also suggests different ways we could respond. And then on the positive side, good feelings, we can also start thinking in more detail about, okay, the difference between being serene, in which we are just untroubled and tranquil, being energized when we're feeling good in a way that is we want to take action, we want to do something, and feeling good in the sense of valued or respected or belonging, and that how different activities can produce each of these different kinds of feeling good. And finally, Lisa Feldman Barrett says that in moments of stress, we should really try to cultivate this habit of pausing, of taking a break before speaking and using our ability to breathe. Breathing is one of the few things that we do both voluntarily and involuntarily. We can control our breath, or we can just breathe without thinking about it. That puts some attention into your breath, and this allows you to suspend, to take a little bit of time to notice what's happening inside your body before then responding. And she makes a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is in the moment, it's automatic, whereas responding is something that you reflect on what is the best way to act in that moment. So here are some strategies that can help us develop this capacity for interoception that is critical for dialogue. And finally, a very important concept in dialogue is to try to bring tacit knowledge to the surface. So tacit knowledge, first described in the works of Polanyi in the 60s and 70s, experiences, ideas, skills, and opinions that people have but that are not codified and might not be easily expressed. They're the things that we know that we might not be conscious that we know. And if we're not conscious of it, that means we're not aware of how it can be valuable and maybe valuable to the group. And this paper of Leonard and Sensiper argues that tacit knowledge may be one of the most important assets of any organization. That what the organization codifies is what is on the surface. That's the charters and information and documents and records. But what the organization knows is much bigger than this. It goes on to include all the experiences and stories and norms that structure the life of that organization. That is often the majority. It's the iceberg below the surface. And so one of the goals of dialogue is to take what's below the surface and bring it to the surface so that we can use it to make better decisions about how to act. So tacit knowledge includes things like how you drive your car, includes a million things that you don't necessarily are aware of, but that help you do it. Playing the piano, you build skills over many years that you can just play a C major chord. How to get someone to answer an urgent email. Again, you don't follow a checklist of rules in your brain. You have a set of tactics or strategies to get people to respond. How you choose arguments that certain people on your team or your boss will find persuasive. How you handle conflict in your cultural context. All of these things, you have a lot of knowledge, but much of it is probably tacit, meaning you know it, but you don't have a conscious list of all the things that you know. And this tacit knowledge can be blocked below the surface in the case of power dynamics, where certain people act as authorities and block other people from sharing what they know, or situations where people don't trust each other. They're not going to share this knowledge, or just they don't know each other well, where there are taboo subjects that for cultural reasons, a lot of this knowledge stays below the surface. People are just too pressed by time and overwhelmed by tasks in order to share what they know. And also people have different styles of communication. Some are more direct and some are more indirect, and that this can also limit the amount of tacit knowledge that we can gain from other people. And so finally, they say, how do you get tacit knowledge to the surface? Well, this, according to their research, requires extensive personal contact, regular interaction, and trust. And so one of the goals of dialogue is to create the conditions, that special kind of personal contact in which trust is possible, and therefore where the tacit knowledge of the group can come to the surface and be useful for the group. So these were some of the basic concepts of dialogue that we wanted to share before getting into the practical examples and exercises, and I hope you enjoyed it.